Look at her. She thinks she's above everyone else." The businessman's mocking laugh echoed through the plane as Sarah Davis sat calmly in her seat, even as turbulence rattled the aircraft. But minutes later, when 3 armed hijackers stormed the cabin and held a gun to a flight attendant's head, the plane collapsed into sobs and terror. All except Sarah, who kept breathing steady, her eyes unshaken. The co-pilot froze when he recognized her discreet hand signals, the unmistakable code of a Federal Air Marshal. And in that instant, she changed the fate of the entire flight. Sarah's hands rested lightly on her plain navy sweater, fingers still, her simple canvas bag blending into the economy class seat. The plane lurched again, overhead bins creaking ominously. Most passengers gripped their armrests, their knuckles white, their breath short and jagged. Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes were closed, not out of fear, but focus. Before we continue, if you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type strength below and tell me where you're watching from. This story hits different when I know who's standing with Sarah. I read every comment. The little girl beside her, maybe 6 years old, clutched a stuffed elephant, her face streaked with tears as the plane shook violently. Sarah opened her eyes just long enough to glance at the girl, offering a small nod like a silent promise that everything would be okay. The girl stared back, her sobs slowing, mimicking Sarah's steady breathing. Across the aisle, a woman in a bright pink blazer, her nails painted to match, leaned toward the businessman who'd spoken earlier. She whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "No emotion at all. What's wrong with her? Doesn't she get how serious this turbulence is?" The businessman, his tie loosened and his Rolex glinting, snorted, "Yeah, probably some nobody who thinks she's too good to panic like the rest of us." His voice carried sharp and smug, drawing a few nervous laughs from nearby seats. Sarah's eyes flicked toward him just for a second, her face unreadable. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The way she tilted her head just slightly made the businessman shift in his seat, his smirk faltering. A man in a tailored suit, his hair slicked back and a gold chain peeking from his collar, stood up, pointing at Sarah. "You're just sitting there like this is a game," he snapped, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "What? You think you're tougher than the rest of us?" His hands shook, betraying his bravado, but his words stung, and a few passengers nodded, their fear turning to resentment. Sarah's fingers paused on her bag's strap, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. "Sit down," she said, her voice low, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made him freeze. He sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath, but the tension in the cabin only grew thicker. The little girl's mother, a tired-looking woman with a messy bun, leaned over and touched Sarah's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's been crying nonstop, but you calmed her down." Sarah gave a small smile, barely there, and nodded again. She adjusted her bag under the seat, her movements precise, like she was arranging tools instead of a worn canvas tote. The plane steadied for a moment and the cabin's tension eased, but the whispers didn't stop. A young guy in a hoodie, his earbuds dangling, muttered to his friend, "She's acting like this is just another Tuesday. Who does that?" His friend, scrolling on his phone, shrugged. Maybe she's just clueless. The plane's intercom crackled, and the pilot's voice came through, calm but strained. "Folks, just some turbulence. We're leveling out now. Everything's under control." The cabin exhaled, some passengers clapping weakly like they needed to believe it. The little girl beside Sarah let out a shaky breath, her elephant hugged tighter. Sarah leaned down, her voice low. "You're doing great," she said, and the girl's eyes lit up like those words were a lifeline. A few rows back, an older man in a faded jacket watched Sarah, his brow furrowing like he was trying to place her face. He didn't say anything, just kept staring, his fingers tapping his tray table. A woman with overdone makeup and a designer scarf leaned across her seat, her voice dripping with disdain. "Some people just don't know their place. she said loud enough for Sarah to hear, sitting there like she owns the plane. Her friend, a middle-aged man with a loud tie, chuckled. Bet she's never even been on a flight like this before. Their words sparked murmurs from others, a ripple of judgment spreading through the cabin. Sarah's hand rested on her bag, her fingers brushing the zipper, but her face stayed calm. She turned slightly, her eyes locking on the woman for a moment, and said, "You'd be surprised." The woman's laugh caught in her throat, and she looked away, fussing with her scarf. The turbulence had passed, but something else was building. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with forced smiles, their eyes darting nervously. Sarah noticed it immediately. The way their hands trembled slightly, the way they avoided eye contact with certain passengers. Her training kicked in, every sense heightened. A man in his 50s wearing a wrinkled business suit clutched a photo of his family. His voice broke as he glared at Sarah. "You're not even trying to help calm people down. What kind of person just sits there?" His words trembled, raw with genuine concern for his loved ones, and the cabin's anger toward Sarah flared hotter, passengers nodding in agreement. Sarah's eyes softened for a moment, catching the photo in his hand. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but kind. "Your family's waiting for you. Stay calm." The man blinked, his grip on the photo tightening, and he sat back, his anger faltering as he looked at her, confused but quieter. Under her sleeve, Sarah's fingers brushed her smartwatch, tapping a sequence so subtle it looked like she was adjusting her cuff. Miles away, in a dimly lit control room, a security coordinator stared at a blinking dot on a screen. "We have a signal from Air Marshal Davis," he said, his voice tight with focus. A team around him scrambled, pulling up satellite feeds and radio channels. Back on the plane, Sarah leaned slightly toward the little girl's mother, her voice barely a whisper. "Keep her calm. Whatever happens next, keep her close." The mother's eyes widened, her hands shaking. "What do you mean? What's going to happen?" she asked. But before Sarah could answer, the young guy in the hoodie overheard and snapped, "Stop scaring people, you're making it worse." The cabin door at the front suddenly rattled. Not from turbulence. This was different. Sarah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her muscles tensing like a coiled spring. The businessman with the Rolex noticed her change and sneered, "Now what? You finally scared?" But Sarah wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the cabin door, watching, waiting. A flight attendant named Jennifer approached the front, her name tag catching the light. She fumbled with her keys, her movements jerky and unnatural. Sarah's training screamed warnings. The attendant's behavior was all wrong. The trembling hands, the way she kept glancing at her watch, the beads of sweat on her forehead despite the cool cabin air. The woman in the pink blazer noticed Sarah's intense focus and hissed. "Now she's staring at the crew. What's her problem?" The businessman leaned forward, his face red with irritation. "She's been acting weird this whole flight, making everyone uncomfortable." But Sarah tuned them out completely, her full attention on the unfolding situation that none of the other passengers could see coming. The cabin door slammed open with a metallic crash that silenced every conversation. 3 men in black masks stormed in, their boots heavy on the carpet. Guns gleamed in their hands, compact, deadly pistols that caught the overhead lights. The leader, a tall figure in a black cap, grabbed flight attendant Jennifer by the arm, yanking her toward the front of the cabin. Her name tag reflected the harsh fluorescent light as she stumbled, her face pale, a small gasp escaping her lips. But there was something wrong. Her fear looked rehearsed, her movements too coordinated. Sarah's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a random hijacking. Jennifer was part of it. The leader pressed his gun to a passenger's temple, an elderly man in the front row who'd been quietly reading a newspaper. "Listen up!" the hijacker shouted into a handheld radio, his voice like gravel. "Ground control! We want $50 million and safe passage. You've got 1 hour, or this old man dies." The cabin erupted in screams. Passengers ducked, some sliding to the floor, others clutching each other desperately. The elderly hostage's eyes darted around, pleading, but he didn't make a sound, his military bearing evident even in terror. Sarah didn't move. Her hands stayed folded, her breathing even, but her eyes tracked every detail. The young guy in the hoodie, now crouched in his seat, pointed at Sarah with a shaking finger. "Look at her. She's too calm. She's got to be with them." Heads turned, eyes narrowing with suspicion and fear. The woman in the pink blazer hissed, "Why is she just sitting there? She's not even scared." The businessman leaned forward, his face flushed red. "What are you, some kind of plant? You're freaking everyone out." Sarah's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "I'm not with them," she said, her voice quiet but firm, like a door clicking shut. The businessman opened his mouth, then closed it, sinking back into his seat. Sarah's fingers moved to her bag with practiced precision. Hidden beneath a false bottom was something that told a different story than her simple appearance suggested. As she carefully reached inside, her fingers brushed against cool metal, a FEDERAL AIR MARSHAL badge worn smooth from years of duty. But it wasn't just any badge. Engraved on the back were the words 9/11 Never Forget and a date, September 15th, 2001. 4 days after the attacks that changed everything. 4 days after Sarah had sworn an oath to ensure no plane would ever be used as a weapon again. The badge represented more than her authority. It carried the weight of 3,000 souls and a promise made in grief and determination. The little girl beside her reached for Sarah's hand, somehow sensing safety in this one calm presence amid the chaos. Sarah let her hold it, her thumb brushing the girl's knuckles gently while her other hand remained near her bag. The child's mother watched with tear-filled eyes, beginning to understand that Sarah was different, special somehow. "Your biggest mistake," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the hysteria, "was assuming I was just another passenger." The leader spun toward her, his gun swinging from the elderly hostage. "What did you say?" he snapped, his voice sharp with growing alarm. But Sarah wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were on Jennifer, the flight attendant, whose mask of fear had slipped just enough to reveal cold calculation underneath. "Inside job," Sarah said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "She's been feeding them information. Watch her hands. She's signaling." The businessman who'd been mocking her fell silent, his face pale as he realized what was unfolding. The woman in the pink blazer clutched her armrest, no longer focused on criticizing Sarah, but suddenly desperately hoping this strange, calm woman had a plan. Because if she was right about the inside threat, they were in far more danger than anyone had imagined. Years ago, Sarah stood in a sterile government building, her hand raised as she took the Federal Air Marshal oath. The date was September 15, 2001. Around her, other recruits, pilots, police officers, military veterans, all united by the same determination. The instructor's voice echoed through the room. "You are the last line of defense between terror and innocent lives." She'd been a different person then. Younger, angrier, driven by the images that played endlessly on television. The towers falling, the planes used as weapons, the faces of passengers who'd made final calls to loved ones, knowing they were going to die. Sarah had watched it all and made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of her life. Her training had been brutal, months of learning to blend in, to become invisible while staying hyper-aware. Combat training, psychology, crisis negotiation. Every skill designed to turn an ordinary-looking woman into a guardian angel at 30,000 feet. She'd practiced the same scenarios hundreds of times. Armed hijackers, suspicious passengers, mechanical failures, medical emergencies. But her first real test had come 2 years later, on a flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. 3 men had attempted to storm the cockpit with makeshift weapons. Sarah had been in seat 14C, reading a magazine, looking like any other business traveler. In 90 seconds, she'd neutralized all 3 threats and saved 247 lives. No one had even known she was there until it was over. That was the beginning. Over the next 18 years, Sarah had flown millions of miles, always alert, always ready. She'd stopped 6 more hijacking attempts, 3 potential bombings, and countless other threats. Each time, she'd remained invisible until the moment action was required. Each time, she'd returned to her seat afterward like nothing had happened. The toll had been enormous. No normal relationships. How do you explain that you can't discuss your job, your travels, or why you sometimes came home with bruises you couldn't explain? No family of her own. The risk was too great. The commitment too complete. Sarah had given up everything normal people took for granted to keep them safe. She'd retired just 6 months ago at 45 with commendations from 3 different presidents and a record that would never be made public. But old habits died hard. Even on this personal flight to visit her sister in California, Sarah had chosen an aisle seat with clear sightlines to both the cockpit and rear exit. She'd profiled every passenger during boarding, noted the nervous flight attendant, tracked the unusual pre-flight delays. Now, as the hijackers moved through the cabin, Sarah's training took over completely. Her mind cataloged every detail: the leader's left-handed grip on his weapon, the second gunman's obvious military background based on his stance, the third one's nervous energy that marked him as the weak link. And Jennifer, the inside accomplice, whose trembling hands couldn't hide her practiced signals. The elderly hostage in the front row caught Sarah's eye for just a moment. Something in his bearing, the way he held himself, even with a gun to his head, told her he was military too, probably Vietnam era, based on his age. A fellow warrior who understood that sometimes you had to fight, even when the odds were impossible. The little girl's grip tightened on Sarah's hand as one of the hijackers stalked past their row. Sarah squeezed back gently, her thumb tracing small circles on the child's knuckles. This was why she'd given up everything. This innocent face, this trusting touch. Every sacrifice had been worth it to keep children like this safe. Under her breath, so quietly only the little girl could hear, Sarah whispered, "Close your eyes, sweetheart. Count to 10 with me." The child obeyed, her small voice joining Sarah's in a whispered countdown. It was the same countdown Sarah had used in her training, the same rhythm that had preceded every successful mission. 1, 2, 3. The time for hiding was almost over. "Time's up!" the leader snarled into his radio. "We want that money transferred now, or the old man dies." His finger moved toward the trigger, and the elderly hostage closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. The cabin held its collective breath, some passengers sobbing, others praying silently. That's when Sarah stood. The motion was so smooth, so deliberate, it felt like the air itself shifted around her. "Federal Air Marshal," she said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Release the hostage." Her badge was now visible, pinned to her sweater, catching the light like a shield. The simple passenger had vanished, replaced by someone who commanded the space around her. The leader spun toward her, his gun swinging from the elderly man. "Sit down, lady, or you'll be next." But Sarah was already moving. 20 years of training compressed into 3 seconds of fluid motion. She closed the distance in 2 steps, her hand snapping up to twist the gun from his grip with a move so precise it looked choreographed. Her elbow cracked against his jaw with the sound of bone meeting bone. He crumpled, unconscious before he hit the narrow aisle. The gun clattered away, sliding under seats as passengers scrambled to avoid it. Sarah didn't pause. She spun, her movements a blur of controlled violence, facing the second hijacker. This one was ready for her, his military training evident in his stance. But Sarah had fought men like him before. She sidestepped his lunge, her knee driving into his stomach with surgical precision. As he doubled over, gasping, her hands found his wrist, applying pressure to a nerve cluster that made his fingers spasm open, dropping his weapon. The third hijacker, the nervous one, raised his gun with shaking hands. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "I'll shoot everyone!" But his fear made him predictable. Sarah read his body language like a book. The way his weight shifted, the direction of his eyes, the slight tremor in his gun hand. She moved like liquid mercury, flowing around his line of fire. Her hand shot out, striking his throat with just enough force to cut off his air without permanent damage. He collapsed, clutching his neck and gasping, his weapon forgotten on the floor. 3 trained killers neutralized in less than 15 seconds. But Sarah wasn't done. Her eyes locked on Jennifer, the flight attendant who'd been part of the conspiracy. "You," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Hands where I can see them." Jennifer's mask finally slipped completely, her face twisting with rage and fear. "You don't understand," Jennifer hissed, backing toward the galley. "This was bigger than just money. This was justice." Her hand moved toward something hidden in her uniform pocket, a device Sarah recognized immediately. A dead man's switch, connected to what was probably a bomb in the cargo hold. The cabin erupted in fresh screams as passengers realized the danger wasn't over. But Sarah's voice cut through the panic like a blade. "Everyone stay calm. Move toward the back of the plane, slowly and quietly." Her tone brooked no argument, and people began to comply, instinctively trusting the woman who'd just saved their lives. "You think you're a hero?" Jennifer snarled, her thumb hovering over the switch. "You have no idea what you've cost us, what you've cost the cause." But Sarah could see the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that her plan had failed. Desperate people made desperate choices, but they also made mistakes. "The cause?" Sarah said, stepping closer with deliberate calm. "You mean terrorizing innocent people? Using children as leverage?" She gestured toward the little girl, who was now clinging to her mother in the back of the plane. "That's not a cause. That's cowardice." Jennifer's face contorted with rage, and her thumb moved toward the trigger. But Sarah was already in motion, her training and experience giving her the split-second advantage she needed to end this threat once and for all. Sarah's hand shot out with lightning precision, her fingers closing around Jennifer's wrist just as the flight attendant's thumb touched the dead man's switch. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in a deadly tableau, one woman representing terror, the other protection. Then Sarah's training took over. A sharp twist, a pressure point strike, and Jennifer's hand spasmed open. The device clattered to the floor, its red light blinking ominously. Without hesitation, Sarah scooped it up, her years of experience allowing her to quickly identify and disable the trigger mechanism. The light went dark. The threat was over. Jennifer collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "They promised it would be different this time. No one was supposed to get hurt." But Sarah had heard those words before, from other broken people who'd been manipulated into believing that terror could somehow serve justice. The plane began its emergency descent, the pilot's voice crackling over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an unscheduled landing in Denver. Emergency services are standing by. Please remain in your seats and follow the instructions of our Federal Air Marshal." Federal Air Marshal. The words rippled through the cabin like a revelation. The businessman who'd mocked Sarah sat in stunned silence, his face pale as he processed what had just happened. The woman in the pink blazer stared at the badge on Sarah's sweater, her earlier disdain replaced by something approaching awe. As the plane touched down, the cabin door burst open and armed FBI agents poured in, their tactical gear stark against the commercial airline interior. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing the unconscious hijackers and taking Jennifer into custody. The agent in charge, a tall man with graying temples, approached Sarah with obvious respect. "Agent Davis," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Director Robert Harrison. Outstanding work, as always." The passengers nearby gasped at the title, Director. This wasn't just any FBI agent. This was someone from the very top of federal law enforcement, treating their fellow passenger like a decorated hero. Sarah shook his hand firmly but briefly. "Just doing my job, Director." But Harrison shook his head, his expression serious. "No, Agent Davis, what you did today went far beyond duty. That bomb in the cargo hold, our techs confirmed it was real. You didn't just stop a hijacking." You prevented a massacre. The elderly hostage, now free and standing with the help of a younger passenger, approached Sarah slowly. His military bearing was unmistakable now, his back straight despite his age. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I served in Vietnam, saw my share of heroes, but what you did today—" He paused, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for giving me the chance to see my grandchildren again." Sarah accepted his handshake with quiet grace, then turned to check on the little girl who'd been her anchor throughout the ordeal. The child ran to her, wrapping small arms around Sarah's waist in a fierce hug. "Are you really a superhero?" she whispered, and Sarah knelt down to meet her eyes. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm just someone who believes that good people should help protect other good people." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense, then returned to her mother's arms. As passengers began to disembark, many stopped to thank Sarah personally. The businessman who'd called her a nobody couldn't meet her eyes as he shuffled past. The woman with the designer scarf whispered a barely audible apology. But Sarah wasn't interested in their shame or redemption. She was focused on the living, the 247 people who would go home to their families tonight because sometimes quiet strength was exactly what the world needed. Later, the news would report a failed hijacking attempt and an unnamed federal air marshal. Sarah's identity would remain classified, her heroism known only to those who'd witnessed it firsthand. She gathered her simple canvas bag, adjusted her plain navy sweater, and walked off the plane looking exactly like the unremarkable passenger she'd appeared to be when she'd boarded. But the little girl would remember. And someday, when she was old enough to understand, she'd know that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear cardigans and sit quietly in seat 12C, waiting for the moment when ordinary people need someone extraordinary to keep them safe. To everyone who typed strength and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.